Alone with the Devil. A short horror story. Written by Michael van der Voort. Narrated by Robin Reads. As a linguist and historian, I've always been fascinated by words and phrases. I am particularly interested in how certain idioms and expressions come to be picked up, where they originated, and what, if any, history lies behind their origins. It was this interest that led me in 2018 to consider writing a paper on the dialect, idioms, and aphorisms used by people in my hometown. It was also what led the kid known as Skit to spend a night alone with the devil. In the small rural town where I grew up, in the hills of northern England, the phrase alone with the devil is a very common one. It's a quaint, if mildly sinister, little idiom that if you stick around town long enough, you're almost certain to hear. It was of particular interest to me as a linguistic historian, not only because of its colourful history, deeply rooted in the heritage of the town, but because the phrase has multiple meanings that themselves link back to its origins. So fascinated was I by this one turn of phrase that I actually wrote my master's dissertation on it. Though since the thing with Skit, that's something I tend not to talk about. As I mentioned, the phrase alone with the devil is one that has several connected but slightly different meanings and applications. One refers to someone who appears to be stunned or shocked by a piece of news or a surprising turn of events, and is similar to that other phrase, he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Standing at the bus stop, in the covered market, or any other place where elderly women and gossips congregate, you will often hear this phrase through the gleeful telling of half-whispered reports and rumours. "Oh, I'll tell you should have seen his face. When she said she were pregnant, honestly, it looked like he were alone with the devil." Another meaning or usage is to suggest that someone has placed themselves in an awkward and difficult-to-escape situation, usually through an unwise choice of words or an act of stupidity on their part. This usage is particularly interesting as it also implies not only that the situation is somewhat of their own making, but also that whatever punishment they receive is entirely deserved. In this usage, the phrase might be said to be similar to the ideas expressed in phrases like boxed themselves into a corner, made a rod for their own back, or the modern phrase to tug on Superman's cape. "Well, I guess he should have kept his mouth shut. He's alone with the devil now." "Well, if you decide to go alone with the devil, then this is what happens." In every usage, the phrase relates back to a curious incident in the town's long history. Whilst it's regarded by most as just a bit of local folktale or a ghost story to tell the kids, a little bit of digging reveals that there is at least some truth to the tale and some serious history behind it. It is a fact, for example, that both the main players in the story did exist, and it is also true that one of them had a very abrupt and sudden change of occupation. There's also physical evidence you can hunt down if you know where to look. The story itself concerns a local cunning man who went by the name of Old John Hutton. For those who have never heard the term before, cunning men and women, collectively referred to as cunning folk, were in some ways England's answers to shaman or witch doctors, and were generally regarded as benevolent. These figures were often noted for their knowledge of medicinal plants and herbs, as well as incantations and spells that would help with the relief of physical ailments. In all likelihood, these individuals did possess some basic herbal knowledge and understanding of practical medicine which they reinforced through so-called spells to assist the psychological as well as physiological recovery. In other words, their success was probably 80% due to knowing what plants to use and 20% using the religious or spiritual beliefs of the patients to induce a placebo effect. According to most historians, these cunning folk were often, but not always, figures of advanced years who tended to live in isolated areas on the outskirts of town. Some historical surveys estimate that at one time there would have been a cunning man or woman within 10 or 12 miles of any village in England, acting almost as the local doctor. Now, remember, this much is not fantasy, but history, provable through records and archaeological evidence. Where the line with legend starts to be crossed is when these cunning folk are accused of what is known as maleficium, that is, using magical means to hurt or harm others. A charge which, in combination with an increased religious fervour in the country, led to accusations of witchcraft and diabolical pacts. It's these kinds of accusations that make up the meat of our story. Old John Hutton, we know from town records, lived in an old stone house up on the Alderton Moor. The moor itself is a barren, open place, covering the hills that stretch between the valley towns in this part of the world. Made up mostly of peat and gorse grass, the moor comprises a vast, featureless expanse that is as hostile as it is haunting. Nowadays, the moor attracts hikers on their way between villages or out on tougher expeditions, but even in the modern day it remains a place where people can easily get turned around and die of exposure. Every year, the mountain rescue teams in our area pick up dozens of tourists who, having set off on what they think will be a pleasant hike, end up in difficulties when they become lost and night begins to fall. In short, and in keeping with the usual pattern for cunning folk, John Hutton's home was about as far out of town as it was possible to be. Yet it remained a place visited by many, seeking his help and advice. The house itself, believe it or not, is still standing. It is up on the top of Monk's Hill and is passed by farmers and hikers almost every day. Nowadays it looks like little more than an abandoned barn, basically a big empty rectangle made up of 4 walls of rough laid stone with a beam and thatch roof and what appears to be a dirt floor. I say it appears to be a dirt floor because the story goes that the floor is not in fact made of dirt, but of stone. Not only that, but this basic flooring actually makes up the ceiling to another, far larger and secret room below the surface that can only be accessed via a trapdoor. According to the legend, it was in this subterranean room, beneath the surface of the moor, with no windows and in the pitch black, that old John Hutton performed the more sinister parts of his business. Whilst in the rooms above he attended to people with arthritis, diseases, and unwanted pregnancies, it was in the space below, which he referred to as his under room, that he would speak his wicked spells and diabolic rites, conjuring all manner of deities and demons, whilst locked away from the rest of the world. What is interesting about this accusation, however, is that it does not seem to have stopped people going up there in search of help. We have records and testimonies given by the townsfolk of having been assisted by John Hutton, and the impression given by the sources that survive seem to be of a kindly old man who simply knew things others didn't. The idea that Hutton did anything that might be construed as wicked seems to have started with just one source, the sheriff, Arthur Salt. After the accusation was made, however, Hutton did little to stop people believing it. Whilst you might reasonably assume that the phrase "alone with the devil" would come from the idea of Hutton practicing his dark arts alone in his basement, it actually comes from a later challenge put forth by old Hutton to the famous Sheriff Salt. It was, so the story goes, Salt rather than Hutton who would find himself in such undesirable company. Whilst most folks believe the witch craze that led to burnings and hangings across Europe was one long and unified period of persecution, this isn't actually the case. Nor is it true that everyone in Europe was terrified by, or even believed in, the existence of witches. For a brief period, during the 16th century, whilst other parts of Europe were putting their citizens to death for witchcraft, the English judicial system actually took the charge of maleficium, that is, doing harm to others through the practice of witchcraft, off the list of offences. Whilst an act was passed in 1542 proclaiming witchcraft a felony and therefore making it a capital crime punishable by execution, this same act was actually repealed after 5 years and removed entirely from the statute books, meaning that for a period of around 20 years, in the middle of the 16th century, there was no official law in England against the practice of witchcraft. Later, with changes of kings and the influence upon belief systems from continental Europe, the offence was reintroduced, and prosecutions massively increased, but for a brief period there you could not be charged with the actual act of being a witch or inflicting harm through magical means. What you could be charged with, though, was falsely claiming that you could do such things, particularly if you were making a profit from it. You could, for example, be charged with falsely claiming to provide services or goods that relied upon magic, sorcery, or consultation with spirits. Meanwhile, whilst you could not be directly charged with witchcraft, the more zealous members of the clergy and local authority could make life very uncomfortable for you if you were suspected of such things. In short, during that 20-year period, the same period during which Hutton and Salt crossed swords, you could not be prosecuted, but you could most certainly be persecuted. This is where the sheriff and Mr. Hutton clashed. You see, Hutton's trade was in selling treatments and charms to the locals, with the guarantee that his remedies were obtained by magical means and worked because they were made following instructions given to him by either angels or other spirits that he had summoned in his basement room. This, to the sheriff, was an offence, because Hutton was claiming something which the law, at that time at least, claimed to be completely impossible. Confusingly, whilst Salt seems to have hated Hutton for being a witch, what he actually charged him with was, in effect, false advertising. An official declaration made by the sheriff in 1550 banned Hutton and any similar cunning folk from selling such goods and remedies, a declaration that essentially robbed the town of its herbal doctor, and Hutton of his living. Hutton, however, had a very clever response. If, he challenged, there is no such thing as a spirit, and if the sheriff was so confident that he could not have gained his cures, ointments, and charms from such entities, then why would he not prove it? With a notice put up all around town, Hutton mocked the sheriff publicly by daring him to spend one night, just one night from the setting of the sun to its rise next morning, in the under-room alone. A copy of the notice still exists in the local library, complete with a hand-drawn demon in the corner. I would recommend anyone who has the chance to seek out a copy of this document, referred to as Hutton's Missive, just for the purposes of seeing that drawing. It is a hideous black smudge of a thing, rendered in a mix of charcoal and ink, as if Hutton, when drawing it, was struggling to find a black enough material to show the darkness of the thing he depicted. It stands on its hind legs, which, recorded with admirable accuracy, resemble the taloned feet of a bird, like a chicken or a hawk. Affixed to the back are tiny wings, more like those of a bat than a bird, and atop the seemingly massive head, a pair of curving horns can be seen. It is an ugly thing to look at, but notable, especially when you consider what came later. "If he should go down," said Hutton, "and allow me to close that door behind him, if he would remain inside but for the extent of 8 or 10 hours, and if he would spend but one night alone with the devil, then I would forfeit all of my wares and give up all of my claims. I will leave this town and not return if he is to spend but one night alone with the devil. If he is to prove what he believes and show us all that he fears nothing but God, this I challenge him, and to this I expect an answer." Of course, Salt could have ignored the note. He could have declared Hutton a fool, and announced that he was both too busy and too dignified to lower himself to answering such a challenge. But he didn't. Perhaps, as I believe, he was pressured to accept the challenge by the townsfolk, not only as a way of keeping face, but because his decision had outlawed their only access to treatment for their afflictions. "If he's so sure," I imagine them saying, in a 16th century equivalent of the gossip at the bus stop, "then let him go up there and prove it. Let him go to the under-room and be alone with the devil." And so he did. Sheriff Arthur Salt, on May the 16th, 1550, went to the home of old John Hutton, high on Alderton Moor. He descended into the under-room and spent a night below alone. After that, he was never the same. Arthur Salt was removed from his post the following day and replaced 2 weeks later by a man named Cooper. Little is written about the reasons for Salt's removal from office, nor is there any surviving record of what actually happened once he went down into the under-room, though of course there are many legends. In terms of hard facts, we can but only guess. The only piece of tangential evidence that has survived is a record from a monastery 18 miles away, where, in November of 1550, a full 6 months after the night in the under room, a man who is listed in the monastic records only as Salt, and later as Brother Dunstan, was listed as having taken up residence and presumably taken the vows to join an order and remain there. It is interesting that Dunstan was chosen as a name for this new entrant, especially considering the saint's legendary battles with the adversary. Beyond the monastery's records, the only historical evidence of this Salt is a book allegedly written by him. The text itself is a roughly bound collection of individual sheets onto which almost the entire text of the Bible has been copied in a small, neat hand, only for every single page to then be horribly defaced by what historians believe was the very same penman. This document, which currently resides in the British Library and can be viewed upon request, is known either under the erroneous title of Brother Salt's Missal or, more popularly, as the Scratch Bible. What is particularly notable about this document, especially if you happen to have seen Hutton's missive prior to viewing it, is that on every one of its 1,200 pages there is a drawing of a creature plastered over the text. Some of the 1,200 drawings are violently scribbled, scratched onto the neatly printed pages with such force that the surface below has buckled and torn. On those pages, the ink is often smudged with liquid, as if the person writing or drawing was in tears when they worked. On other pages, the figure is rendered with a degree of careful, naturalistic accuracy and artistic talent well beyond what Salt was thought capable of producing. It is a figure remarkably similar in appearance to the one depicted in Hutton's missive. Of course, modern secular scholarship would account for the similarities by pointing to the fact that Salt had clearly seen Hutton's own drawing. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that a man as religiously committed as Salt would be psychologically damaged by the experience of being locked alone in the dark with the promise of the devil's company. The resemblance between the drawings shows only that Salt had adopted some species of monomania as a result of his experience, and was reproducing as closely as possible what he had seen in Hutton's missive. We do not even know for certain whether this Salt, who later became Dunstan, was even the same man. When it comes to collecting actual hard evidence from the 16th century, we are often left with only fragments, though, of course, that does not stop the legends from growing. In my town, the story goes that Salt did indeed see Old Scratch down there in the under room. In some versions, he is dragged out the following morning by a group of local men, screaming and crying after having gouged out his own eyes. Fascinatingly, if this final detail could ever be proven, it would make the existence of the Scratch Bible even more astounding, as it would suggest it had been somehow written and drawn by a blind man. A detail which, in light of more recent events, chills my blood to consider. Whatever version of the myth you believe, it is clear that this incident left an indelible scar on the minds of the local community, and the phrase passed into the local lexicon from that point onward. It is still heard today, even in spite of what happened. Whilst you might take this information and think that it would make excellent material for a study, a book, or even the kind of schlocky documentary you find on the Discovery Channel nowadays, no such project is ever likely to emerge. I, for one, gave up my own investigations into the phrase following the events of last May. Not only because I found them deeply disturbing, but because I can't help but feel a certain amount of responsibility. Having decided that the history of this particular idiom was to be the central subject of my thesis, I began conducting research in the local area, both in the town records and in conversations with local residents, asking whether their use of the phrase was just something they had picked up or linked to their knowledge of the story. I collected their personal versions of the legend and explained what I was hoping to do. In time, as always happens in such a small town, word got around. Soon enough, there was a feature in the local paper about me and a brief outline of the story in its most basic form. That's where the trouble started, and why I feel like I'm partly to blame. The lads who went up there purposely waited for May. The live stream video was uploaded on the exact same night that Salt went up there all those years before. The video was taken down by YouTube the next day, but the ones leading up to and advertising the stunt stayed on there for about a month after. They're gone now, too. I was shown the footage about a month later by a friend who had downloaded or screen-grabbed the whole thing because he knew of my interest in the story. I watched it once and told him to delete it. I have heard you can still find the footage on the dark web if you know where to look. I don't. Nor will I ever go looking. I don't ever want to see that footage again. Once was enough. The boys involved were not from my hometown. For them, Alone with the Devil was not just a turn of phrase, it was a challenge, a stunt, and a way to build their audience. How they heard about my research or got hold of the article in the local paper, I'm not sure, but a copy of it was referred to and held up on screen during one of their videos advertising the stunt. In fact, they did a summary of the entire legend in much the same way that I have here, with the addition of a few more gory details and imaginative additions for effect. The video, which summarized the story, was full of demon imagery that was either from the wrong century or just had literally nothing to do with the original myth. But then their viewers probably didn't know that, and the idea was to make the stunt seem as dangerous as possible. The YouTube channel they posted to had a moderately large cult following long before they decided to head up to Alderton Moor. The basic premise behind the channel was that this group of adventurous and fearless young men would break into and explore abandoned places, buildings, and landmarks, especially those that had an interesting backstory or that were in some way supposed to be haunted. Now, in all of my time researching the history and origins of the phrase, I had never once mentioned how people felt about the structure in the modern day. To me and my work, the relevant information was about the past. The spooky stories of the present were not relevant. But that doesn't mean they weren't there. As a kid growing up in that town, you knew from an early age to avoid the house with the under room. Most kids in the area referred to the old stone structure as Hut's house, after Hutton himself, and whilst there were always teenagers tempted to go up there and use the abandoned stone-built site as a hangout in the summer, that was a daytime activity. They always seemed to find their way back to town by nightfall. There were stories, of course, stories told by a friend of a friend about the kids who had stayed out there at night, of how 5 of them had stayed up there drinking and camped out on the upstairs room, but when they woke in the morning there were only 4 of them. Other stories said that kids who fully intended to leave and head back to town had accidentally stayed beyond sunset. When they packed up to go, they heard a voice calling to them from below, from under the trapdoor and inside the under room. When they panicked and bolted down the hill, the voice changed into a screaming, vicious snarl. A sound that one teller explained to me was like someone had locked 10 dogs in there and starved them until they started to rip each other apart. As an adult, it was easy to dismiss those stories. As a kid, there was not a chance in hell I was going near that place, in daylight or otherwise. Funnily enough, I've still never been up there or stepped foot inside. But those boys did. In the days before the challenge, they interviewed people in the town, asking them how they felt about John Hutton and the under room. What they got in return was a collection of stories similar to the ones I've just reeled off, none of which deterred them, but all of which brought more interest and more viewers. The main instigator in all this, and the guy most keen to accept what he called the Alone with the Devil challenge, was a guy named Skit. I doubt that was his real name, but it's what he went by in the videos. He was a lanky, skinny-looking guy of around 20 years of age, who reminded me of the character Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. Same lank hair, scrubby beard, and crooked half-slant of a smile. On the night of the challenge, he stood before the camera reading off a script of carefully prepared notes, hyping up how dangerous it was to accept the challenge and head below. What's strange about the footage, and what you'll see if you ever find it, is that just before he gets ready to go below, there is a strange pause, a silence, during which all the boys stop for a moment and the camera rolls on with dead air. At that moment, they're listening. Off camera, you hear one of the boys ask if anyone else heard that. What they were supposed to have heard, I don't know. Rolling the tape back and listening again, there doesn't seem to be anything you can pick out. but the boys definitely heard something. After that, their demeanor changes. From the joking frivolity that had characterized the recording up to that point, the mood suddenly changes to one that is far more serious. As two boys in the background lift the ancient wooden trapdoor using a crowbar and a spade, we see below a cavernous, open space. A gaping wound in the middle of the floor leading to a world of black. The boys doing the lifting seem to be in high spirits, but Skit is looking worried. Whatever it was that the boys supposedly heard, clearly it had rattled him. Looking into the camera, you can see in his eyes a level of trepidation that wasn't there moments before. When another boy says that it's almost time, we see his Adam's apple bob up and down with a heavy swallow, as if he is trying with all his might to straighten and steel himself for what might be coming. Finally, he approaches the hole. Slowly but surely, he lowers himself, like a worker descending through a manhole down into the sewer below, into the darkness. Off camera, someone shouts, "See you in 8 hours," whilst another, with a hideous cackle, screams, "Say hi to the devil for me." Skit raises his hand into a thumbs up as he disappears out of sight. He goes into that darkness without ever saying a word. In the videos leading up to the challenge, the boys agree on camera that Skit will not be let out, no matter how much he screams and how much he begs. The more cynical amongst us might then assume that when he did start screaming, raving, and bawling, begging to be let out because "there's something here, there's something here," the entire thing was set up beforehand, agreed by the entire crew so as to make the live stream more dramatic and interesting. Because of the pitch black below and the idea they'd gotten from somewhere that part of the challenge for Salt was to remain entirely in the dark so that his own mind could play tricks on him, Skit did not take a camera or a light below. Now I know what you might be thinking. If he did not film below the surface or even take a camera into the under room, then what on the video could be so bad? The answer is Skit himself, when they tried to pull him out. Exactly 8 hours after they shut the trapdoor and sealed him below, the rest of the crew opened it up to let their friend out. What emerged was not the same thing that entered. Skit had no clothes. None were found in the space after the fact, and no explanation has ever been given as to where they went. All I know is that Skit emerged without them, and without a single hair. Now, I have read in many stories accounts of people's hair turning white with fright. In theory, it isn't something that should happen in real life. What I have never read about is the complete removal of hair, not just from the head, but everywhere. Facial hair, underarm, even the eyebrows and eyelashes, gone. Whatever happened to Skit whilst down there, he emerged naked, completely hairless, and blind. The footage ends with 3 of the boys trying to lift their fractured friend out from below, and another calling an ambulance. For almost a year, that was the last I heard of the incident. There was a report in the local paper, but it offered nothing more than a cursory overview of the incident with no real insight into what might have occurred. Apparently, the police went to the site and checked the building, both above and below. What they found were 2 empty stone rooms. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to report. A month ago, I was sent a letter at the university from an undergraduate student not in the field of linguistics, but in folklore and comparative religions. She was writing to ask if I could offer any help on a dissertation she was hoping to write on the old John Hutton "Alone with the Devil" legend. I said I would be happy to support her in any way I could, and we exchanged a few emails back and forth to discuss the basic ideas of her study. We arranged to meet a few weeks later so that she could go over a plan, and so she could show me some stuff I might not have seen. I was intrigued by this idea, but also a little reticent, worried that she might try to show me the footage of that awful challenge again. She didn't. But what she did show me chilled me almost as badly. What she brought with her were photographs of documents, writings produced by a man named Edwin Skitlow, Skit for short. These documents, she said, were produced by Skitlow over the course of almost a year, one sheet a day, every day. Despite having never been a religious person and despite now being legally blind, he had written, word for word and in perfect order, the text of the King James Bible, starting at Genesis and now approaching the end of the book of Numbers. On every page the student showed to me, Skitlow had printed the words perfectly, in neat, tightly packed lines, only to then draw over and deface his work with versions of a drawing that was horribly, eerily familiar. The young lady's name is Emily Jensen. Her work on the rural folklore of northern England, and particularly her essay on the Alone with the Devil myth, will be submitted later this year. Having handed over my own research materials, I withdrew from any further involvement with the piece. Somehow, I can't help but feel like I've done enough damage already. It might be worth mentioning that Skitlow does his work under supervision in a secure ward. He was committed shortly after the filming and is considered to have been severely psychologically damaged by the incident. According to Emily, because of his tendency to become violent, he spends much of his time in his own room alone. Unfortunately, though, I fear that even then there may always be somebody with him. This has been Alone with the Devil, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2024 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.